This is the first part of the lecture on ecosystem diversity and change. This will focus on biodiversity and evolution. The book starts out in chapter 4 telling us about the different types of biodiversity. In biology class, you probably only learned about one type of biodiversity, and that's what we refer to as species diversity. But in environmental science, we learn about 3 other types as well. Not just species diversity, how many different organisms there are, but also diversity that is in genetics within that species, diversity of an ecosystem, and the diversity of ecosystem processes. This is an excellent picture in your book that shows you what those 4 statements mean, so all of the definitions are right there, but it's also going to give you a visual representation, which is really nice. So starting in the top left corner, you've got functional diversity. We've already talked about ecosystem services, and that's what we're focusing on here with function. What are the different things going on in an ecosystem that allow energy to flow and materials to cycle? That's functional diversity. Going clockwise then, ecological diversity, we're talking about how many different ecosystems there are in an area, or we can be talking about the entire Earth. If we want to talk about an area like the rainforest, we might have little tiny microclimates. An even better example is to talk about a desert and how you can have an oasis, which is a different type of ecosystem within a larger biome. Going down to the bottom right corner then is species diversity, and this is what most people are referring to when they just say the word biodiversity. Diversity of life, a number and abundance of species present in different communities. And the last one there on the bottom left is your genetic diversity, and this is a really neat picture that's in the book all on its own and in one location. But you're seeing all different shell types of one species of snail. And so you can tell just by looking the diversity that must be present in the genetic code to produce oranges and black swirls and white swirls and white shells and even green shells. So even a species that we don't typically think of as being terribly different from one another, it really is. And when the genetics play out in your phenotype instead of just your genotype, it becomes very, very obvious. So why is biodiversity so important? And we touched on this a little bit already when we looked at why we would want species richness and species evenness. Biodiversity is important because it is part of Earth's natural capital. Remember, natural capitals, we're talking about things that we get from the earth, not only goods, but also services. It provides food, wood, fibers, energy, medicine. Okay, so there we're talking about goods, things that we can profit from. It preserves the quality of air and water and maintains fertility of soil and helps us dispose of waste and control populations of pests. And those last 2 there are truly ecosystem services. If somebody asks you, why is an ant important? Well, it's really important as a detritivore to get rid of those dead organisms that are on the sidewalk or that are in your yard so that we don't have to constantly deal with it and we don't have to put it in the garbage. Nature has a way of disposing of its own waste, and that's part of functional diversity. So where do species come from? And this is a little bit of a review of basic genetics that you guys have looked at before, again, in biology. But we're going to break it down to just some very, very simple steps. So first off, we want to talk about evolution, the change in a population's genetic makeup over time. We're talking about macroevolution here. So if you're in an AP Bio class, we are not discussing microevolution, just macro level. And of course, we credit the idea of evolution and presenting the idea of natural selection specifically to Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of Species. But right around the same time, Alfred Russel Wallace was coming up with the same ideas. So both of those men do get credit. Darwin, though, is of course the one that's named is famous for his theories on evolution, which have become accepted as part of our scientific background. The last bullet on there, if you've not seen one of these before, this is a phylogenetic tree. And what we attempt to do in genetic ecology or in genetics in general is we attempt to make connections between the most like species to show how they branched off in evolutionary in an evolutionary timeline. And so if we were to put ourselves on that tree of life, we would be closest to the other great apes. We would be further away from something like a dog, and we'd be even further away from something like a butterfly. And so that's what a phylogenetic tree is. The closer that you are, the less branching between you and another species, the more alike you are in evolutionary terms. And this gets us some really interesting things, like a rock hyrax is most closely related to an elephant. If you've ever seen a rock hyrax, they're furry and they look like little rodents, but they're really more closely related to an elephant. So again, some very interesting things that will come up when you look at evolutionary relationships this way. But this is a basic phylogenetic tree showing us the main branches, the main kingdoms. And the thing I like about this one that we've got in the book is it shows where in time the branchings occurred. So the first thing that we get is the eubacteria. Now over time they have changed, but we see that the branching of the eubacteria and the archaebacteria is the closest in time, the closest on the tree. And so that lets us know that they are evolutionarily much closer than a eubacteria to a protist or a fungi. And so again, if we look at that, what's interesting to me is we see that plants there are very closely related to some protists and not as closely related to fungi, but we as animals are a little bit more closely related to fungi. Well, how did we come up with these ideas? Obviously, Charles Darwin and his finches that he found on the Galapagos were one way that we discovered this theory, but fossils become another key piece to the story of evolution. Fossils are physical evidence of organisms that existed a long time ago. And looking at these fossils, we can see how internal structures have changed and have stayed the same over time. But the fossil record is incomplete. And the reason for that is primarily that fossils only form under certain geologic conditions. You have to have died, you have to have not decomposed, and you have to have been trapped in sedimentary rock and preserved. So that's a whole lot of must-haves, and so we do not have a complete fossil record. Some people will use that as a slap against scientists for not being able to support evolution fully, but there are simply some times when we do not have a location where fossils were being made in the geological time period. Here's an example of a fossilized skeleton. This is a herbivore that lived during the Cenozoic era. And you can see that we see some very common morphologies. We see 4 legs, we see a tail. So again, when we look back at fossils, we can start to count teeth and count digits. This one appears to have 2 front toes and 1 hind toe. So it would be more closely related to something like a horse than to something like a dog, which would have more of those digits. And so we can learn a whole lot from fossils, even though the species is no longer around. Genetic makeup of a population can change, and so these are some basic rules of evolution. It is populations, not individuals, that evolve. Populations become genetically different. We don't talk about a single organism as having evolved. So some steps to evolution. First thing that has to happen is you have to have genetic variation in your population, and this occurs through mutations in reproductive cells. Then you have to pass on those genetic variations, and this occurs through natural selection. Natural selection acts on individuals. Those who are best suited with the best traits will be able to pass those on. Survival and reproduction are key here. Natural selection is often referred to as survival of the fittest, but it's survival of those most likely to reproduce. This is all about reproduction with genetics. for natural selection to occur, so we've got tons of differences, but for natural selection to occur, a trait must be heritable and lead to differential reproduction. You cannot pass on a trait for missing tonsils just because you had a tonsillectomy. That is not a heritable trait. The other thing is it has to lead to differential reproduction. It must make you more likely to have a mate and reproduce. And this is where that term survival of the fittest comes in. But fittest for some birds is being able to collect a lot of blue ribbon and make a nice array of blue to showcase their beauty and nest making. That leads them to find a mate. So it is not always strength. It is not always brains. It can be many, many different factors. But again, it has to be inherited and it has to lead to differential reproduction for natural selection to occur. Some examples, thick fur. That's a great one. The animals that have thicker fur were more likely to survive the Ice Age. Genetic resistance is one we talk about a lot in recent times because bacteria are becoming resistant to antibiotics. If you don't take the full course of antibiotics, then the ones that survive are the ones that are resistant. The next offspring for their generation, the next generation, inherits that resistance and passes it on. And so the bacteria become more resistant over time to the antibiotics that we have failed to take the correct dosage of. This is a picture in your book that shows the idea of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. You see these two blue guys have a resistant strain in their genes. So if you take your initial doses, you get rid of most of their red bacteria, and the blue ones survive. Again, if you don't finish your course of antibiotics, they reproduce and they proliferate, and eventually that is the only bacteria that's left. MRSA is a perfect example of this. You've got Staphylococcus infection that has become resistant to certain antibiotics, and that's why MRSA is such a bad case and why it spreads in hospitals where there are a lot of sick people and a lot of antibiotics. There's three choices. If the environment changes, you can adapt, move, or die. We've already discussed that in a previous lecture, but this is why adaptations occur, is changes to environmental conditions. So in summary, for this first part, genes mutate, individuals are selected, and populations evolve. The population, once it evolves, is now better adapted to survive and reproduce under the present environmental conditions. And that's it for part 1.